Alright, ladies and gentlemen, it is Friday, June 12th, and today we're going to revisit the topic of the recent Black Lives Matter protests and the events that have been taking place all over the United States over the last few weeks. And the first thing I want to do today with regards to that topic is thank you for your responses, taking the time to respond in last week's Google form. It's an important part of being a citizen to pay attention to the things going on around you and around us, to ask questions and to learn, especially when those topics make you uncomfortable, or it's a topic you don't know a lot about, or you're not familiar with. A lot of you said that the events and news of the past week, the things leading up to the protests themselves, caused you stress or distress, and it made you upset. That's understandable. I've had that same experience, that same reaction. My friend, my wife, everyone I know feels the same way that you do. At the same time, your responses to this question, what can you offer to others, was uplifting. Your responses. So many of you offered support to people feeling distressed, even though you felt the same way. And that shows real strength. It made me proud of you to read Google form. You had the opportunity to ask questions. It's the first thing that you got to do. And there were two questions that came up a lot. The first one we answered last week. That first question, the one that I think I saw the most, was why are there protests and why do these protests sometimes become violent? If you have that question, watch last week's video. I promise I answered it with historical context, and then also trying to explain why the protests sometimes become violent. Tonight, I'd like to address the other question that I saw asked a lot, which is why is there so much anger towards the police? Basically, that question boiled down to there are hundreds of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of police in the United States. Why are Americans angry at police in general when it was just one bad police officer who killed George Floyd? That's a complicated question, and I'm going to try my best to answer it tonight. All right, so let's get started with, first of all, we have to talk about something called the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is everything that goes into making, enforcing, and judging criminal laws. The criminal justice system, it appears, needs reform. It doesn't treat minorities equally. Minorities are incarcerated at disproportionate rates across the country. Minorities typically don't have equal access to. They don't have access to the same legal representation that whites do. Bail and pretrial detention are typically more severe for minorities, and sentencing for minorities tends to be harsher than for whites. This is a systemic problem. Police are the most outward-facing part of the criminal justice system. They're tasked with enforcing laws and keeping people safe. Being the most outward-facing part of the criminal justice system means that we see police every day. And they have the most interactions with the general public of any part of the criminal justice system. Most of us have not sat in a room as the law was being written, or in a pretrial hearing, or spent time in jail. But almost everyone watching this video has had some sort of interaction with a police officer, and everyone has seen a police officer doing his or her job. What that means, unfortunately, though, for police officers is that they become the face of a broken system. And the history of the criminal justice system matters in this case. Historically speaking, this criminal justice system has really existed to maintain white supremacy or segregation in the United States. You guys know a lot about this. The first police departments in the United States were in the South and were slave patrols. They were tasked with making sure the property of white slave owners stayed on plantations, or if they escaped, they were returned. When slavery was abolished, police departments across the South enforced rules and laws meant to deny black Americans equality and deny them the right to vote. Even after the Supreme Court decided that segregation and Jim Crow laws were unconstitutional, police departments took an active role in denying voter registration drives or access to public facilities. In fact, up until the last 20 years, I think the most lasting images of police brutality that we see or know of come from the South, when state police departments and local police departments viciously beat civil rights activists who were trying to register to vote or who wanted equal treatment in restaurants. In many cases, police departments were closely linked to the Ku Klux Klan in the South, and they worked in concert with them to thwart civil rights progress or to terrorize blacks. They took place in lynchings across the United States in the South before the 1960s, and notably, police in Mississippi worked with the Ku Klux Klan to murder 3 civil rights activists in 1964. Northern police departments don't have a much better history. The first police departments were created to protect property for the wealthy, and as the Great Migration took place, when millions of black Americans moved to the North, police departments were increasingly tasked with enforcing racist laws and housing segregation, or community segregation. And what I'm saying isn't that police departments or police are racist today because they were racist before, but I'm just trying to highlight their role in what historically has been a broken criminal justice system. And even after the civil rights movement ended in the 1960s, the criminal justice system has continued to play an outsized role in minority communities. Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States in 1968. He ran on a law and order campaign in that election year. He, in part, wanted to restore normalcy in northern cities where race riots broke out in 1967 because minorities, African Americans especially, felt they were being mistreated in northern cities. Under the Reagan administration and into the 1990s, under Bill Clinton, the federal government emphasized crackdowns on drugs and low-level criminal offenses, which is called broken window policing, to deter more serious crime. The result of those policies has been more police interactions and greater police presence in impoverished minority communities where crime rates are typically higher. On its surface, sending police where the crime is makes some sense, but an unintended consequence has been strained relationships between police and minorities. And one example that hits close to home is in New York City, with a policy called Stop and Frisk. Stop and Frisk is, and these sorts of stops are also called Terry stops in the United States. Officers stop people on the streets, or in New York City's case, they can be the streets or subways. They ask a person questions, and at times search or frisk those stopped. A frisk could be a pat down, or could be a little more invasive, looking for weapons or other sorts of contraband. At its peak, about 10 years ago, more than 600,000 people a year were detained as part of stop and frisk in New York City, and more than 88% of those people were completely innocent, which means they were not arrested or given a summons, or given a summons. And at its height, those stopped were disproportionately black and brown. Stop and frisk in New York City is still in use today, but with much less frequency. But black and Latino residents of New York City are still disproportionately affected. So between 2014 and 2017, 80% of stop and frisk stops have been of black or Latino people. Even in places where black and Latino people make up a very small percentage of the population, in 6 of those districts, they still make up an overwhelming majority of stops in stop and frisk. You can see here in this chart, for example, in Kips Bay, Murray Hill, and Turtle Bay, a little less than 8% of the total residents are black and Latino, but they make up 74% of the people stopped in those neighborhoods. Black and Latino people were more likely to be frisked than whites, and among those frisked, they were less likely to be found with a weapon. And this sort of policy extended into young black and Latinos as well. Between 2014 and 2017, Black and Latino males, ages 14 to 24, made up 5% of New York City's population, but they made up 38% of reported stop and frisk stops. That means more than 30,000 stops were of young Black and Latino males. Just though, as with the larger statistical group, 80% of those stopped were innocent. That means they had no ticket given or arrest was made. And when we compare the statistics across the board for how these stops are conducted and how they're escalated, we see that in general, Black, white, and Latino people are about as likely to be innocent as each other, but Black and brown people, Black and Latinos, are more likely to be frisked or patted down, and they're more likely to experience the use of what is called force, an escalation from being frisked. And it appears that this trend, this sort of thing that's happening in New York City with stop and frisk, appears to also extend to traffic stops in other places around the country, based on an analysis of traffic stop data conducted by Stanford. In recent years, according to Stanford, Black drivers have been somewhat more likely to be stopped than whites, but they've also been far more likely to be searched and arrested. Of course, people in charge, police commissioners, the mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg, for example, not the mayor anymore, but was the mayor of New York City, defended stop and frisk. And he said that the program worked because police went where crime was, or where crime is. But you know from your own experiences, even in school, that being accused of something that you didn't do, it can be hurtful and bothersome. It'll be annoying to you, right? Like teachers say, you didn't turn in this assignment, but then you show them that you did. That is frustrating. I can hear you in school and in class. I wasn't even saying anything. I was just turned around. It's not my phone. I was looking down. It's a frustrating experience for someone to tell you you're doing something wrong, or to make you feel as though you were doing something wrong when you weren't. And for Black and brown people, most of whom are innocent, their interactions with police, for the most part then, are negative. They're being stopped for what they feel is no good reason. They're being frisked, which can be violating. And it feels like they're being targeted and treated unfairly. As with you, these types of interactions can cause frustration, mistrust, and tension. And then, when we see an event like the murder of George Floyd, those tensions erupt. Because for minorities who feel as though they're being mistreated and targeted by the police, the murder of George Floyd is just the most egregious example of a discrimination that they live with every day. I hope that this answered your question about why people are in general upset with the police.